Hi everyone, welcome back to the Robertson Media Center, UVA. Today we're going to delve a little deeper into DaVinci Resolve with more advanced effects in audio, as well as the basics of color correction. Again, this video series is intended for beginners and only really covers enough to get started. Back here in DaVinci Resolve, we are going to talk about a very basic form of animation. Animation just means change over time, right? Movement. And so we're going to start by talking about something called keyframes. And these are sort of like a graph of how that change over time is going to happen. So as you can see down here with this JPEG I have introduced, there's sort of a graph happening here where I have 2 points and there's movement happening between those points. So as I kind of scroll along, take a look. Social platforms. See how it gets larger over time, and as you can see here, it's listed as zoom. So it's zooming in from this point, 1.08, up to 1.42. Now, keyframes aren't only for zoom, they're for almost any attribute that can change over time numerically. These keyframes build directly off of the last video, so if you haven't checked that out, make sure you check out all of the properties in the inspector panel. But let's return to the inspector panel. Up here in the top right corner, if I select it, it will turn it on. And I have all of these properties that I can play around with as we looked at in the last video. However, any of these properties that have this little kind of diamond shape here, this dot, this means you can animate them over time using keyframes. So everything from opacity, zoom, position, rotation, cropping, right? All of these you can change over time. So let's look at how this works. I'll start on a new one. Come over here to the YouTube JPEG. And let's say I want it to zoom in. Well, first thing I need to do is set the original zoom. So let's say at the beginning, I want it to be a little bit further out, perhaps right there. And then I click this little button. This is going to create your first keyframe. See, it turns red when it's selected. And then I'm going to go later on in this clip near the end. Near the end, I'm going to create another one. Again, press this little keyframe button here. And as you can see, the keyframe then turns red. And that's when I can make my adjustment. So let's say I want it to zoom in and end up being this large. Now, if I come back to the beginning of that clip and I press play, then through sites like Reddit, so you can see that it's going to zoom in a little bit between those 2 points. So we have an origin point and a destination that it's going to. Let me press play again. Then you can notice that that looks a lot like what we mentioned last time, what we called Ken Burns. Of course, Ken Burns is a documentary filmmaker who made things like Ken Burns Civil War, where there's a lot of images that are zoomed in like this, which is why it's named after Ken Burns. But it's also in this program called Dynamic Zoom. Come down here, double click here, you can create that automatically. But the nice thing about doing it here in this zoom property is that you have direct control exactly when things happen and how. Now, one way we can see this better in the one we just created is if you hover over down here, see that little kind of S curve there? This is going to bring up, once selected, your keyframe viewer. This looks a lot like the last clip we showed, right? We have 2 points, and you can see this sort of a graph. And if I were to grab this one, I can intensify that, zoom in. And if I were to drop this one down, right, I could create it from 0 all the way up. I'm gonna undo, Command, Control Z. And this is where you can kind of view what's happening. When you change your properties up here in the inspector panel, it's a little harder to tell what's going on, which is why you can turn on or off this keyframe viewer. Keep in mind that you can also select which property you're looking at in the keyframe viewer by hitting this little arrow here. And then there's a drop-down menu. So right now I'm looking at zoom, but I could also be looking at opacity or rotation, things like that. A couple things to note: if you're in your regular selection tool, the arrow tool, you can click and select these individual points and move them around, up and down or back and forth to get exactly the right spot. You can also create what's called a Bezier. A Bezier makes, instead of a linear path between these two, you can create a curved path. If I were to intensify that curve,
then through sites like,
right? So you can kind of go up and out. What this is really useful for is easing in or easing out and creating a smooth sort of transition rather than something a little bit harsh, which is like the linear. You don't have to do this. You can also return it back to linear by selecting this button there. So how do I edit these? Well, you'll notice that only when your playhead is located exactly over where one of these keyframes is will it be lined up and show as red. So if it's right here and you think it's pretty close to being on there, it's not quite unless it lines up as red. So this is where you need to use these little arrows, and you can find your keyframes this way. So this is the previous keyframe, and you can go to the next keyframe with this little right arrow back and forth. And just like anything else, you can remove it or reset by using this little reset button here. So let's try another attribute. Let's say we want a fade in, and then we can add a blur to that fade in, which is kind of a nice transition sort of effect. So let's go to opacity and double click it. This is where you can select which property you want to use. And here I can create a keyframe point and drop the opacity down to 0. And then you choose where you want the fade in to end, right? Where you want the opacity to be 100%. And you can create another keyframe and drag that opacity up to 100%. I can see my opacity change happening over time.
then
If I wanted it to last longer, I could drag it out longer.
then through site,
And then I can add an effect. If I go over to my effects library and I go under open effects, let's say I grab my Gaussian blur, drag it onto my clip, and then I can see up here under open effects I have all of my properties here. And you'll notice these properties also have keyframes. So I can increase the strength. I can go back to the beginning of my clip, create a keyframe, go to the end of my fade in and create another keyframe and drop that blur down to 0. So now I have both an opacity keyframe change and a blur keyframe change. Let's take a look at what that looks like.
then through sites like Reddit,
That's one example you could use. Let's try another example. Let's say we want it to have a sliding line that kind of cuts it off here. If I come down under cropping, I can create a keyframe at the beginning. Let's say we want it to start here, and we want it to come in from the left side. Create a keyframe. And then I choose the end of my clip, or close to it. Create another keyframe, and I can have it crop all the way out. So now watch what this looks like.
Reddit,
So you can see that there's kind of endless possibilities you can choose with all the different properties that you could put in these keyframes that change over time. So in this one, I could do more than one at once. So if I click this arrow and I choose that I want it to also rotate, let me create a keyframe for rotation angle. So you can have many of these. Actually, you could have every single property if you'd like to, kind of changing over time with keyframes all at once in a single clip. I'll point out if you don't see some of these properties that I have down here, you may need to zoom in. You can see they disappear as I zoom outward. And even in the detail view, the arrow here doesn't show up. So you can actually just double click to bring up a different property if you have the clip selected. But the easier thing is just to zoom a little bit further in, and you can see it, then the arrow shows up here. Zoom back out. Another thing you might want a clip to do is, let's say, slide in or slide out, or you could have multiple shapes kind of moving through a space. If you would like to do something like that, you can see why that could be useful for motion graphics, for instance. So let's have this Snapchat image kind of fly in and then fly back out. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit till it fits the full frame. Go to my first frame of this clip and select position. And here I can create my first keyframe. And
then
let's say I want it to actually end up right here, so I could create another keyframe. And then I can go back to my first one and adjust the X axis until it goes off frame. Then let's say I want it to fly off, but this time fly upwards. So let me create another keyframe. And let's say I want it to stick for a minute. So I create a fourth keyframe so that it's staying in the middle for a moment. And then between this point and this point. And then it can fly off to the final point. Let's say you use the Y-axis. Let's see what this looks like.
And then mainstream social media platforms.
So there are thousands of things you could do with this. As you can see, it's pretty powerful. And this type of thing translates really well if you've ever used something like Adobe After Effects. They function very similar to this. And so this is how a lot of motion graphics and things are made, with keyframes in different programs. But in DaVinci Resolve is actually quite powerful, since so many of those attributes can be changed over time. In addition to all of the settings that you can do keyframes on video, you can also use keyframes for audio. So if I select this Memes Audio 4 wave right here, you can see I have clip volume, clip pan, and pitch. So all of these I can also use keyframes on. So I could keyframe the volume. We've already done that, of course. If I come over here and I expand my audio tracks, I have this volume bar, and I can create keyframes on that very easily with the option button. But undo that. You can also do panning this way. One more thing to add, in the effects library over here, you can turn that on with this button here, effects library. There's a section of audio effects. The first one is noise reduction. If I drag and drop it on this clip here, then I get this panel where I can try to remove the noise from my clip. So if you're doing interviews or something like that, and you have some background noise, you might be able to get it slightly better. Can't always remove everything that you've recorded. Kind of what you record is what you have, but you can make it a little bit better, potentially using the noise reduction. You can listen to the noise only, for instance. You can see the output levels, and you can see sort of what it's doing as I press play.
Or it's an email.
And there you can see what kind of noise that it's picking up based on frequency. But I'm going to close this window, hitting this little X here. And then you can scroll down in your inspector, where we've been here before, and you can find your noise reduction here. Hit this little trash can to delete the effect. Another one we can look at is reverb. So I'm going to drag and drop that in here. And this is going to create reverb artificially. So of course, reverb is the sense of space, right? How long sounds bounce around in it and what materials it's made of. So you can tell the difference between a gym, where if you clapped your hands, you could hear that reverb going on for a really long time, and maybe a closet full of clothes where there's no reverb at all because of all the soft surfaces. So you can adjust and try and find what level of reverb you would like, and then you can adjust them all here. Note that you can take the presets here. So a cathedral is going to have a ton of reverb versus a plate, which is going to be very flat. Let me show you what the cathedral sounds like when I add it to this clip. Right? You can hardly understand me because there's so much reverb. But if you want that effect, you can find those here. I'm going to hit the X here. Another place to find your settings is over here in the inspector panel. Now, to get more effects, you're going to have to leave the edit workspace. Remember I said at the first video that down here you have all these different workspaces, and you kind of move from left to right. So you start out importing media over here, you move into the edit workspace where you're going to do most of your editing, where we spent most of our video series. And now we can move on to, there's 3 other spaces before you get to deliver where you export. In our next video, we'll talk about that. But these three offer three very different types of more advanced editing effects and color correction and audio work. And we're going to go through each one very quickly and talk about them. If you want more details on those, you'll have to seek a more specific video. Let's start with Fairlight. Fairlight is where you can do a lot of your detailed audio work. As you've seen, most of what we can do is actually in the editing workspace. This is just a little bit more like a digital editor. Like this looks a lot like Adobe Audition, for instance, where you have all of your mixers here. We've talked about mixers and how to add those into the edit workspace, but they are automatically inside of Fairlight. You will also notice you have the effects library. You can turn on and off. The media pool you can turn on and off over here, just like in the edit workspace. Track by track, you can adjust effects, what's called an equalizer, which we'll go into in just a moment, panning, and then you can adjust the volume of a whole track. So this is a little bit more like a soundboard, if that's what you're used to. Rather than dropping in effects and editing them, you can actually have kind of channels to work with like a soundboard. So let's go through them. The input, this is where you could select which microphone you want to record from, for instance, as we showed in a previous video. Below that, you can hit plus on effects, and this is where you're going to find a ton of different effects that we haven't covered and won't cover most of these in this panel. The next one I'll talk about is EQ. If you double click this, you can open up an equalizer panel. And you can think about this panel as basically volume into the negative or positive, right? So you're turning up or down. And then you have this axis is the frequency. Frequency is essentially pitch, or at least that's how we perceive it. So we can turn up and down certain ranges of those frequencies where we can find certain sounds. If you were to be recording a voice, certain voices sound better if you give a boost to the bass. You can grab this and kind of pull these up, and you can adjust them down here. So you can see this is number 2. Turn that up a little bit. And then number 3 here, I have Q factor, which is actually how wide or narrow that band is going to be. You can see that there. So I could widen this out. I could increase or decrease the gain, which is how loud, how much you're adding or reducing from that frequency. And then you can adjust exactly what frequencies. And then you can adjust panning, for instance, on a whole track, and volume for a whole track, things like that over here. Now let's move on to the Fusion workspace. Before you do anything in here, you're going to have to select which clip that you want to be editing. Let's go back to the Edit workspace and select one. You will want to both select the clip here and have this playhead over the top of it so you can take a look at it, and then move on to the Fusion workspace. The Fusion workspace is a robust effects suite. It's a little bit more complicated to use. It's node-based, if you've used those before, where you basically have inputs and outputs, and you're feeding something through an effect. So you can think about this like a guitar pedal, for instance. If you feed a guitar into a pedal, and then you feed from the pedal into the amplifier, which then feeds out the sound itself, right? So it's a series of intermediaries, and that's sort of what a node-based editor is like. So rather than cover everything that's here, which would take far too long in a beginner video like this, I want to show you a couple examples of things you can do, which will demonstrate kind of the principles of working with the node-based system. And so let's start with something somewhat simple. We have a media in to media out, and then we need to place our effect in between the two. So if I were to add an effect in here, for instance, let's do a warp. So I'm going to right click, click Add Tool, and down at the bottom, you can see warp as a category, and we're going to choose the grid warp. This is going to allow us to warp very specific parts of the frame and create kind of a ripple effect if we'd like to, things like that we can change. So I'm going to click grid warp, and you can see I haven't connected them yet. So what I need to do is connect the media in into my effect and then back out to my output. So let's grab this and connect it to the effect. And then I can grab my output and connect that here. So now I'm feeding that through an effect. And then I can change whatever I want. The cool thing about grid warp is you can choose individual parts of the frame to pull and change. So if you wanted to kind of squish this that way, then you could do that, and that is going to feed out to the output. So then up here on the right side with this particular effect, all these different settings, so you can change the grid size, for instance. And then you could say, oh, I just want a little bit kind of smushed this way and downward, so it looks like a funhouse mirror or something like that. And then if I return to my editing workspace, I can see that the effect has taken place. And I can take that effect and turn it off if it's kind of bogging down the computer. As you can see, there's this red line here. So if I click this little bypass color grades and fusion effects button, it turns on and off that fusion effect that I have added. So you can do that from the edit workspace and not go back and delete it. You can turn it on and off here. So a couple other things with this. Right here you can see I am viewing in my panels. I can select which ones I want to view based on the right and left panel. So if I wanted to view the original here and then how it's changed over on the right side, I can do that by selecting these little white buttons here. So that's one example of a type of effect that you can add and how to add it, right, through the inputs. If I select this and press delete, I can reconnect here. I can also have a different type of effect. I'm going to create something called a mask. A mask has to go before your input because you're cutting something out before it goes out. So if I click on this one, which is an ellipse mask, and I place it before my media input, then I can create kind of this cutout. And then I can place other footage behind it, for instance. This could be got a little bubble with footage in it that could change and play. And then you can also adjust that circle size, for instance. So I can grab it and pull this any direction that I would like and adjust the shape. I can also move it around by grabbing the center here. If I just wanted this up in the corner, I could do that as well. And that's called a mask. You can do that with a number of different shapes. There's a rectangle, ellipse, and then there's more freeform polygons and splines that you can play with. I'm going to delete that. So far those are two examples. We have essentially what's a cutout. It's called a mask. We have somewhat like a filter, which was the warp. And next we're going to do a matte. So if I right click on here, you can see add tool. And then I can add in the matte category ultra keyer. Ultra keyer is a chroma keyer, which works really well with like something like green screen. As you can see, I have a before and after, which I set up using these little white dots here on the right and left screen to show before and after. You can see I started out with the green in the background and then I cut it out, and this little checkered pattern just means that this is transparent. So I could put whatever background I want behind this kind of figure here. So what you need to do, of course, is connect your input here, your output, and since I can see before and after, I can see everything I do. If I select my effect here, I have all of my settings over on the right side. I'm not going to go into all of them because you can get a pretty good key just by selecting a background color. So if I click this little eyedropper, I can choose a background color, or I can just click here and I can find a good, pretty approximate color. So if I chose the seafoam, it's already doing a pretty good job. And then I can drag this around to try to find a slightly better key. And that looks pretty good. The other thing you can do is some spill suppression. And if you click on spill method, you can add more aggressive spill suppression there. So that's how you would remove a green screen from the background. We'll cover more of these settings in another video about green screening in particular, but this gives you an idea of what the Fusion workspace is capable of. And here you can see a background placed behind it in the editing workspace. The final workspace that we're going to cover today is called Color, and it is to do color correction and color grading. And this is actually what DaVinci Resolve is most famous for in the industry, is its color correction suite. So if I click here, I can adjust the color of my clips, which are listed here, through a variety of tools. Today, we're going to cover the very, very, very basics of this color workspace. If you want to know more about color correction, there are thousands of videos out there. As you'll note, it is also node-based, very similar to our Fusion workspace. You have your nodes here, and you need to connect them in to out. So this is your default preset that you have in your workspace here. You can see your clips all along this center here, so you can select which clip you want to be working on. This is automatically in keyframes. As we've talked about a lot about keyframes, you can keyframe these. But let's hold off on that. And instead, this little symbol here is scopes. And that's going to show us a graph of the different colors and brightness and darkness in here. So essentially shows you what you're looking at here in this window in terms of color. And it looks really complicated, doesn't it? So I'm going to go with a couple really simple ways that you can improve your color correction, and we'll leave it at that. So the first one I'm going to do is go to contrast. Contrast is the relationship of the brightest to the darkest colors. Let me demonstrate with this image here. If I were to increase the contrast, you can see that the whites become brighter and the darks become darker, versus decreasing contrast where you get a lot more grays. So you want to find a good point. Actually, this could use some contrast adjustment. If I reset this, you can see this contrast is actually really helping in this scenario. And in your contrast, you can see what's happening over here in the graph, and you can take a look at it. So these are your brighter colors and your darker colors. You can see you're moving them apart or bringing them together more towards the center area, which is gray, right? We have white up here, gray, and black down at the bottom. And if I increase the contrast, I'm just kind of stretching that curve. The next one is 2 down saturation. So you can increase or decrease saturation. If I increase, you can see the bright colors become much more vibrant and filled with the hue, versus all the way down to 0 is black and white. If you want something a little simpler than those color wheels to adjust color, there's 2 settings that I recommend you start with, and we have temperature and tint. Temperature is based around the different colors that light comes in, all the way from orange up to blue, and that's often the type of color correction you'll need on some footage that's too orange or too blue. You can adjust here. And tint is between kind of green and magenta, and these two will solve a lot of color correction problems that you have. So I'll start with temperature, and you can see on this image, it looks pretty good, but if I were to drag it this way, you can see what that would look like if I was under a street lamp or something, right, where it's way too orange. Then I would drag my temperature this way until, as you can see over here in the graphs, blue to orange, and I can make really minute adjustments to the entire spectrum. Now again, that's not as detailed as going with each individual color wheel, but that will give kind of a macro adjustment that you need. Right next to that is tint. You can see if I drag it over to the right, goes really magenta down to green. So if you have something that's a little bit too green or a little bit too magenta, you can pull either direction until it fits the right color you're looking for. And you can see when there's a problem on this footage, for instance, that there's too much red and too much blue and not enough green, then I may need to return this back more like that. You will notice in your graph, though, there's a lot of space up here, which means this is kind of a dark image, and there's not a lot up in this highlight region here. So I might go to something like gain. Here is a color wheel for gain, but also down here is a slider. Make sure you pay attention to the slider, because the slider is going to be actually more useful for correcting contrast and lightness and darkness. This is kind of your gray and white and black region here. So if you hit the sliders, you can see I can stretch those. If you watch over here what happens when I drag this, I can stretch those curves upward. And now you can see it's nice and bright. It has a lot of contrast, and it moves down all the way to the darkest parts. And you can tell that in here that this looks better than it originally looks. So if I undo it, you can see it was all crunched down over here in the bottom. So gain stretches the lights up towards the top. It's mostly affecting the lighter areas. Reset that. Lift, the one on the far left, is going to stretch the darker areas. So let me choose a different image. This one. You can see how all of it's up here in the super bright range. Makes sense. Mostly a white image. If I were to grab this slider and stretch it downwards, I could get more dark parts of the image and stretch them down towards the darker areas. And then if I were to increase contrast, I could stretch some of the whites back up, and you can see I have a lot more contrast now. Maybe that's not what you want in this particular image, but that's what lift does. Gamma is going to affect the mid-range. So it's going to stretch the middle up or down. So again, lift is the darker areas, so stretch the bottom up and down. Gain is the lighter areas, which stretches the top up and down. And then gamma stretches the middle. So watch what happens when I move this slider on gamma. You can see I'm stretching the middle up towards the brighter end or the darker end by grabbing this slider. So as you can tell with color correction, despite the name, a lot of what you're focusing on is lightness, darkness, and getting a good, well-exposed image. And then after that, you can move on to adjust for particular colors. Now this image could use probably a little bit more saturation. Increase that. I'm going to increase the contrast a little bit, maybe not too much. And then if I look at my graph, it looks pretty good. But if I wanted to make some changes, I might, for instance, bring my gain up just a little bit here. So it's a little bit brighter in the brightest areas. I might grab my lift and I could bring it down, but the contrast adjustment did most of that for me. And then I could grab the gamma and see which way I should stretch it. And I think it was pretty good. I'm going to redo it. Yeah, it was pretty good as it was. Now you can begin to play with color, and that depends on your preferences. You could, for instance, drag these to get the colors a little bit more adjusted, or you could do with curves if you've dealt with curves before. I'm going to grab the lift. You can see what happens as I drag it towards particular colors. These are really minor adjustments that you need to make. So to review, start with contrast and saturation, temperature and tint. If you want to get more specific with color correction, you can go to these individual color wheels here or to the curves and make really specific adjustments. If you want, for instance, to copy the color correction you did on this one to move to a different clip, you can select the node itself and copy. On a Mac, that's Command C. On a PC, it's Control C. Select a different clip and paste. On a Mac, that's Command V. On a PC, that's Control V. And you have copied all of your color correction settings from the other clip to this clip as well. And as you can see, it's highlighted here to show that there's color correction on this clip as well. Okay, that's all we're going to cover in this video. Coming up next, we will show you how to export your final color-corrected perfect project. Stick with us.